Hello, I'm Daniel from TeachKidsRobotics, and today we'll be talking about how do robots read and tell the difference between dogs and cats, an introductory explanation to neural network-based classifiers. So let's quickly review supervised machine learning. Supervised learning refers to machine learning where the algorithm is trained on labeled data to predict or map input features to corresponding output labels. An example of this is predicting a shape. Given an input shape, how can we classify it or map it to the corresponding output so that a star maps to a star and a circle maps to a circle? Similarly, you can consider the question, is something a picture of a cat or a picture of a dog? This takes the input, which is the image, and an output, which is the label, being cat or dog. So, asking and answering that specific question relates to a topic known as classification. Given data and a set of unique characteristics, we want to classify and recognize different objects. And basic classification done by robots and AI comes in the form of a neural network. And I'll explain that a bit more in a few seconds, but in this example you can see we have a dog and a cat. It's fed in as an input. It goes through these different nodes in this graph-looking structure, and then we arrive at an output, and it tells us whether or not it was a dog or a cat. But how does this work? So, what is a neural network? A neural network teaches computers to process data in a way that is inspired by the human brain's neurons. A type of machine learning called deep learning, due to the large number of layers, hidden layers in this case, that use interconnected nodes or neurons in a layered structure to transform inputs into desired outputs. So what you see here is the visualization of how a neural network would look like if you were to draw a diagram depicting it. And you can see it takes in inputs, feeds that data through these hidden layers, and then based on what was in that data, these hidden layers have these adjustments to the data stream that end up in the output layer. And the output is what actually gives us an answer. In this case, if we're trying to do classification, the output could be something like, is this a cat or is this a dog? Let's talk a little more specifically about what is this neural network neuron or node. What is that red dot in the graph, this hidden layer that magically controls and is able to identify whether or not something is something else and do this classification? So mathematically, a neural network neuron accepts some input, that's again in the form of numeric input, that is fed to an activation function, which then maps the inputs into a possibly non-linear output. Effectively, this is just a fancy way of saying that given some data input, that could be a number, it could be a 1 or a 0, it can get mapped into an output of a higher degree or dimension. So we can get basically additional information out of this original input. There are also weights and biases inside of this function that alters the input and feeds it to the next layer that basically scale the input or offset it. Again, at the end of the day, the neural network is implemented mathematically, and the inputs are always encoded numerically, so that these hidden layers are performing math on the inputs and eventually arriving at an answer. And we'll talk more about how this answer, based on classification, is done using these hidden layer activation functions. These activation functions help encode checks for desired dimension or traits of the inputs. So let's talk a little bit more about that dimensionality and the ability to classify what is something. Imagine we're trying to classify the difference between a golden balloon and a tree. So one thing we could do is consider color to differentiate the balloon and the tree. But what if the balloon was green? Now our single dimension color can no longer classify the difference between the tree and balloon. So we introduce a second dimension, roundness. But then what if you had a round balloon? Now you would need to introduce a third dimension, shininess, and so on and so forth. So the different dimensions or the different properties of a given object allow us to classify it, and we encode these different properties or dimensions within the hidden layers and the activation functions. With enough combinations of these checks, we can get a somewhat accurate prediction on what something is based on these properties that we've extracted from the original input, which could be something like an image. So, these neural network activation functions, we know that when the model is trained, the weights and biases, these numerical offsets to the activation function and what is fed to these red nodes in our hidden layers, are modified to maximize the correctness of the output determined via an objective function. So we need some way of saying, yes, the output of this model, the output of the input basically was correct. And that is basically our training data. So that if we have an image of a dog and we have a dog classifier, we'd want to ensure that what is output is also a dog. And if that's not the case, then we'd be adjusting our weights and biases so that we get that correct output that we're looking for. And the output of all the layers encode the answer to that classification question, such as, is this a dog or is this a cat? And the outputs of the output layer are what we actually use then to do this final classification. So if we try to visualize this of, is this a cat or is this a dog, we can see we feed the image in as the input layer. And then that data flows through our hidden layers. It basically gets summed up, and the data flows based on whether or not these dimensions and these properties that we've determined are present within the given inputs. And those inputs are continually reduced until we arrive at our output layer, that being cat or dog. And based on what was present on the input, this system will come and arrive at basically a single output that is of greater weight. So we will get more output towards dog or cat that give us our answer in terms of what is this classification. And if we just think of at a high level, how would we as humans classify if something's a dog or a cat? We might choose properties such as the size, the shape, the tail, the texture of the fur, the color, the height. And these are all things that we can potentially encode mathematically based on the input image. And only if the features are present will the neurons activate, basically contributing to or like voting for what the correct output is based on the presence of these features. So let's do a quick recap again. Images are made up of pixels containing red, green, and blue values. These pixels can be represented mathematically in these matrices, so the image can be represented as numbers. And as we know, our neural network takes numbers as input, performs additional mathematical operations on them, and eventually arrives at our output layer. And based on those hidden layers and activation functions, the output is going to tell us whether or not something was classified as a dog or a cat. And that's all dependent on the input data, which is the image, which could be either a dog or a cat. And this is kind of a general basis also for computer vision, having the ability to represent the real-life image mathematically with these pixel values and matrices, and then analyze them mathematically. Now let's tie it all together, all these pieces of the neural network, the input, the hidden layers, the different features, the output, using a real-life example of, is this image a dog? So we know that our image input, our input layers are going to be potentially different portions of the image, the pixel values, the mathematical representation of that image. We then can feed those values through different layers to perform different steps in identifying, is this a dog? The first layer can be to get the pixel values and determine what is in the image. The second layer can be to actually identify the edges within the image, such as the outline of the dog. The third layer could do something using combinations of edges to determine features within the dog. Given combinations of edges might correspond to different parts or portions of the dog's body, such as the tail or the snout or the legs. Now, once you've identified these features, based on the edges that were present in the original input image, you can say, yes, this has 4 legs, yes, this has a tail, yes, this has a snout, and based off these features that you've identified, you can then basically put them all together, figure out what combination is equivalent or what makes up a dog versus what makes up a cat or something else, and then have all that data feed into your final output layer to do the final vote of, I believe, classification-wise, this is a dog or this is a cat. So how do robots get more accurate classifiers? So how accurate is this really? It really comes down to, again, this notion of the training data, how much data, how many images were fed into the input and deemed to be correct. That basically says, hey, this is how accurate my model is, how accurate that hidden layer is, how many different layers I had, and how good the weights and biases were tuned so that depending on the image, it's giving you that correct output every time. And when you're training the neural network, you can basically feed in images where you know already ahead of time that something is an image of a dog or something is an image of a cat. Then, if your network in the output gives you an incorrect answer, you know you likely need to tune or change these weights and biases until they reflect the answer you expect. And if you do this over and over on multiple images on this labeled training data, where you know that this is a cat or this is a dog, eventually you really improve the accuracy of the system because it's seen enough images and it's figured out at a high level what the right properties are and the combination of properties to come up with a fairly accurate conclusion. So that's the importance of labeled training data and how these models get trained and what training means. It's really adjusting those weights and biases to come up with an accurate answer. So that is basically how a robot is able to tell what is a cat or what is a dog. It uses this neural network, and this neural network, again, is just a mathematical way of encoding our input, such as an image of a dog or a cat, running it mathematically through a series of functions to identify if a given property exists that is unique to the thing we are classifying, and then arriving at that output layer, getting all that data to give us basically a vote on, yes, this is a dog or this is a cat. So, following up with how robots can tell the difference between cats and dogs, we can actually use neural networks to answer, how do robots read? So, if we consider the abstraction that we fed an input image into this neural network and we got a classification out, we can perform the same steps and just choose to classify, instead of a cat or a dog, digits or letters, so we can have A through Z or 0 through 9. So a neural network can be used to once again process the image as long as the hidden layer is set up in such a way that we are looking for what uniquely identifies one character from another. We have then the ability to classify the given character that we are looking at. And this is often referred to as optical character recognition, or OCR. So this is just another way that robots can interpret the visual information, the images of the world around them, and understand what is actually present. It's using these neural networks to encode the world numerically from the image in pixel values, run it through those weights and biases and activation functions found in our hidden network, and then arrive at a conclusion in the output layer on what something is from a classification standpoint, whether it be a number or a cat or a dog. So, classification can be hard. How would you as a human tell apart a cat and a dog? Feel free to leave a description if you think these are accurate descriptions and how hard it would really be for a robot. But if you would like this type of content, also check out our website at TeachKidsRobotics.com for more information about how robots are able to do different things such as sense the world, understand computer vision and what they are looking at, and understand what to do next. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.